Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for making it to this early morning session. So, as you know, our session deals with fixers, their relationship with news organizations, freelancers, and their role in the general journalism community, because they do a ton load of work, especially researching, making sure that foreign correspondents are safe in difficult situations in different countries, so on and so forth. So today we have a very diverse panel of journalists, fixers, editors, and all. So we have Ms. Anna Craig, we have Bobby Ghosh, and Rajesh Prabhakar. So just throwing the stage open to them.
Okay. How do you want to do this? You want to?
Yeah, I think Rajesh could start with his perspective of being a fixer. How does he go about doing his work and the challenges he faces?
Hello, good morning. My name is Rajesh Prabhakar. I'm a fixer, and I'm from the Asia's largest slum called Dharavi. Maybe you can say the world's biggest slum, Dharavi. And been living in Dharavi for a long time. I started my fixing job from last 12 years. Not formally trained as a journalist, but as an ongoing, like working with journalists and news crew. So that's how I started.
Mr. Ghosh, throwing the question to you now. You worked with numerous fixers over your tenure at Time magazine, and just wanted to know, like, there are countless times when sometimes drivers become photojournalists, or sometimes people who are not trained in journalism become very good journalists or fixers, basically, doing the groundwork. So could you highlight some points about the challenges that fixers face with regards to training, security?
Okay. Well, I think this audience would be quite familiar with the nature of the risks that fixers in many parts of the world take, especially when we're talking about fixers in combat zones, in war zones, or in places where there is a repressive government, or there are authorities that seek out to punish anybody who collaborates with foreigners, and especially those who collaborate with foreign journalists. I've had the good fortune of working with fixers in many parts of the world, some in countries where there is no conflict and things are perfectly hunky-dory, and then many in countries that are in various states of distress and conflict. And obviously, the definition is a very broad one. The four of us on the panel have been talking since yesterday evening about the very word fixer. In our experience, many people who perform that role hate that title. So we're trying to come up with a better better name for it, better label for it. And Iona, just before we came in, came up with the flash of inspiration and said maybe we call them field coordinators, because that's what they do. They coordinate. It sounds a little more elegant than fixer. And it's actually a much better description of the work they do. And you're right. Some of them started out as drivers, security people, cooks, in one instance that I know of. And then they, working with journalists, they realize that they can learn some of the skills with journalists and photographers. They also realize that their local knowledge is something that is incredibly valuable. And sometimes it comes from working with journalists that understanding of the value of that local knowledge is unlocked in a certain way. They knew all these things all along. They just didn't realize that these things had value and could be useful to somebody. So yeah, I've worked with, I could tell stories about the amazing journalists, coordinators that I've worked with. But I think that'll become a long fireside chat, and maybe we save that for later.
Ms. Craig, you worked extensively in Yemen, have won so many awards and stuff like that. So I just want to know your perspective on working with fixers in Yemen, despite knowing the local language. Local people open to sharing their experiences with you, or how do you go about your work?
I think my experience has been particularly as a freelancer, and the people that we work with, even for large media organisations, they don't have a protocol of how to offer support for those we rely on in the field. particularly if things go wrong or they need to be, in worst case scenario, evacuated, and even sort of with payment. As freelancers, we pay people a lot less because we get paid a lot less than large media organizations or TV crews would who are coming into the field. And also, we therefore provide a lot less backup for them if things do go wrong, despite relying on them very heavily. I hate the term fixer as well, and I've been struggling to come up with another one. The sort of people who helped me in Yemen, I was living there for 4 years, and now because of the conflicts, I have people in kind of each city across the country who I rely on. And I jokingly then started referring to them as my angels as an alternative, and one of them turned around and said, yes, that's appropriate because when we work with you, we know we're getting closer to heaven. I rely on them extremely. I call them my friends. I not only use them for helping me with my work, but often I'll be staying with them and their families. I know all their children. I've known them for many years. And I'm very aware that if something does go wrong, that I don't have the capacity to be able to get them out of the country easily or necessarily look after them. And in the 8 years now that I've been covering Yemen, only once as a freelancer has a media organization said, what about the fixer and insurance for them? Because as a freelancer, it's always a battle getting that paid for yourselves. And I think there has been a shift in the last couple of years now with organizations like the Frontline Freelance Register that has set out this code of conduct for freelancers when they're working with large media organizations about putting responsibility on those media organizations as well as the freelancers taking responsibility for some issues as well. And I think what we really need is the same for fixers, really, so that they do have some form of support mechanism, that there is an organization that they can go to for advice. We were talking about this outside, and it was something that Bobby raised as well. And I think we have moved on with recognizing that freelancers need more support, and we're still a long way off that with fixers. I messaged one of my angels in Aden yesterday, and he got back to me this morning, and I said, what's your biggest issue? And he said, I hate the name fixer, and also the issue is the recognition. And, as he pointed out, sometimes we do up to 50% of the work, but we don't get the recognition for it, particularly in print journalism. If you're doing TV work, often they will get a credit, but in print journalism, very rarely will you even get an acknowledgement at the bottom of a report. Sometimes there are security issues with that, and that's a responsibility that we have as well. And trying to find the balance between that is giving fixers a recognition or coordinators a recognition for their work without putting them in danger when you're working in a conflict zone in particular. And again, the issue over awards as well. I think, as journalists, we get kind of all the glory, and those that have been instrumental to our work in the field don't get any of that. The Kirk Short Memorial Awards just started up a Fixers Prize last year, but to the best of my knowledge, that's the first time that's happened, and they're the only awards outlet, if you like, that are doing that. And I think there needs to be a lot more credit given to those that are helping us in the field, and a way of recognizing that as well, because otherwise we're just getting all the glory when they're doing a lot of the work.
Yeah. So now, coming back to you, Mr. Ghosh. So do you...
Mr. Bobby, please. Mr.
Okay.
Ghosh is my father.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Bobby. So,
Not Mr. Bobby, just Bobby.
okay. So the next question is: do international news organizations skirt over their responsibility when it comes to fixers?
Some do and some don't. In the time that I worked at Time Magazine, I'm proud to say that on every occasion that the organization needed to step up, it did. In the time that I was in Iraq, for instance, we had one fixer killed, 2 severely wounded, nearly died in an IED explosion, 2 others kidnapped and tortured, and around a dozen of them threatened and forced to leave the country, several of them forced to leave the country. On all of those occasions, the magazine, the company stepped up and did what was right. Providing money, providing, helping them to leave the country when necessary, helping them get medical evacuation and medical support. But in each instance, I had to ask. I had to send a note to New York. The chief of reporters, a wonderful gentleman, he then took the matter to the editors. The editors immediately said yes. Then the matter went to the finance department to spring the money. They said yes. But in each occasion, a series of individuals had to step up. What I'd like to see in organizations like this is a system. This should be automatic. This should not require a request as such. It should not be dependent on the whims of an individual at any given moment. It should be automatic. It should be written in stone. So basically, what I would love to see is in a gathering like this is perhaps not today, but we put our minds together, all of us journalists, editors as well as reporters and fixers, and come up with a set of principles and protocols that all news organizations can adopt, and let's call them the Perugia principles for fixers or coordinators, whatever the correct word is, and let's have a discussion about what they should be on recruitment, on remuneration, on rewards, on recognition. And then what responsibilities you have to the organizations or individuals have to these fixers after the transaction is complete, after the assignment is over. These are not normal assignments. There are instances, and I know from my personal experience, where a fixer working for an organization in a war zone is essentially putting themselves at risk not only for the duration of the assignment, but in some cases for the rest of their lives, or certainly for a long period after the assignment is over. So it's entirely possible, and I live with this nightmare all the time, that it's entirely possible that 10 years from today, and that will be 25 years since the start of the Iraq War, 10 years from today, one of the Iraqis who worked with me at Time Magazine's bureau in Baghdad might be picked off in the street and hurt, heaven forbid, worse, just because once upon a time he used to work with an American publication. What is the responsibility that these organizations have for those individuals? And how long does that responsibility, should those responsibilities continue? Can we create a series of guidelines and resources that maybe are available online? Can we create a system of SOS where a fixer in distress may not have immediate access to the reporter with whom she or he worked? Can they create an alert system by which they send a signal of their distress? And then can we create a system where not just an individual organization or not just a freelancer, but the full weight of the profession of journalism is brought to the assistance of this individual. That's the kind of thing I think we need. As Ayana said, if we are beginning to form these principles for freelancers, why not do those for fixers as well?
Okay. Now, bringing gender to the forefront, just want to know, your experiences working with female fixers versus male fixers, and what kind of perspectives do you get when you have a female fixer and you go to countries like Yemen or Afghanistan and all? Just want to understand it.
Well, in Yemen, sometimes it's essential, particularly when you're in the rural areas. As a foreign male, you wouldn't get access to the female population at all in those kind of circumstances. And certainly if I went with a male fixer who is even Yemeni, they wouldn't be allowed to meet with the women or the families. So in those kind of circumstances, I will always take a female with me, a Yemeni woman, to help. And they're kind of essential in that work. Otherwise, you're limited to kind of 50% of the population. You'll never get access to speaking to the women and a lot of the younger children, because society is segregated in that way, and particularly so in the rural communities. So they're really important for that kind of work. And again, on the flip side, when I've, particularly now in the course of the conflict, is meeting with some of the Salafi militia leaders, they would never do that if you had a female Yemeni translator or fixer with you. and therefore you need a man. So often when I'm doing some of my reporting, in particularly in rural Yemen, is you need both. You have to have both a female with you and a male, even though I can get by speaking enough Arabic. As an outsider, particularly in some of those very remote places in Yemen, it's much better to have a Yemeni with you. And also because the local dialect is often so strong that trying to understand some of the dialogue is really, really hard. And so, yes, the female fixers play a very important role in that. I wouldn't be able to do a lot of my work without that. I have to say, I've never, in all that time in Yemen, had an issue, gender issues in that respect, of people either refusing to meet me or be interviewed because I'm a woman. It's not been an issue. But yes, with a male fixer with me, there's no way I'd be able to go and speak with a lot of the women and the families in Yemen. So that is something you have to bear in mind.
Okay. Next question is regarding credit. So a lot of fixers complain about not receiving credit for the stories. Sometimes they go and find the stories, pitch, do groundwork, come up with case studies and stuff. So is there a uniform system where maybe posthumously they could be credited, or even somewhere down the line when the situation's safe, they could be credited for their work? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think these should be part of the principles. Where can, in what instances, in what circumstances, can a fixer / coordinator be given a joint byline or a reporting credit or recognition of some kind, where it is in their interest not to be given that? Sometimes, they have to make that call. Sometimes in their enthusiasm, they may not always see that it's not in their best interest, and so they must put their head together with the reporter and make that call. But we should also recognize that these situations sometimes are temporary. It could be that today, giving credit to a reporter in Yemen, let's just say, to give a credit to a local fixer, maybe putting them at risk, and you don't want to do that. But God willing, 5 years from now, things get better in Yemen and there's no longer a risk. Then those stories which exist online and will exist online forever, there should be a system by which at that point the fixer can claim and receive a byline or a joint reporting credit for those stories. These things are not fixed in time. They are fungible over a period of time, and I think that's something that's, again, worth creating a set of rules. It should not be left to individuals and organizations to decide on a piecemeal basis. There should be a set of principles, protocols, guidelines, whatever the right word is.
Yeah, I think also, even if it has to be done anonymously at the time, there can still be recognition without being given a name, i.e. you can put at the bottom of a report, this reporting was done with the contribution of a local coordinator or whatever, without giving them a name, because at least there is recognition then that story wouldn't have been possible. I mean, as a freelancer, when you get funding, I've had funding from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and part of the deal is that they have to get credit at the end of that report when it's published. And I think the same should be done for those who are working on the ground. I wouldn't be able to do any of the work that I've done in Yemen, particularly over the course of the war over the last 3 years now, without the help of those people on the ground. Most of them I can't name, and primarily because I want to be able to keep working with them as well. But I still feel that there should be a recognition at the end of every report that I'm doing that says that I've done that with the help of other people, even if I can't put their name on the end of it. Equally so, even last week I was in New York. I went to pick up the George Polk Award that I got for foreign reporting. I stood there on the stage on my own, yet there was a team of at least 2 families and 7 individuals in Yemen that I wouldn't have been able to do that reporting with without their assistance. Yet when it comes to those kind of awards, unless you stand up and say something, when you're there collecting it, they don't get any recognition for it all, other than me, thanking them via WhatsApp on the day, which isn't really enough. So yes, I think because people they're so instrumental in the work that we can produce, that we do absolutely have an obligation to recognize that.
Okay, Rajesh, trying to understand the fixer perspective, what are the key challenges that you face? Maybe security or government? What are the key challenges that you face as a fixer?
So as an fixer, see, it is always a challenges. Whenever a new story comes to us, like they come up with an synopsis. Maybe if it is a documentary or a news channel, they come up with a synopsis, and according to the synopsis and the schedule, I need to fix up everything. So there are very little time for that. So basically, they look out for the stories. For their travel purpose, their hotel purpose, everything is there in that. So again, the challenges is that without getting a permission, it is very difficult to go somewhere and shoot all those stuff. So to getting a permission is not easy, especially in India. So some places it is like very difficult, and to get the permission you need time, like 15 days, 1 month or something like that. And this, whenever this crew come, they don't have much time. They have a limited schedule time, and we have to do all this thing. So that is the challenges what I face.
Securing permission.
Securing permission, all those stuff.
Has there ever been any instance where you've been monitored, where you've been asked not to do the work that you do working with international journalists or presenting the story on an international platform? Has it ever happened with you?
Yeah, it's happened in once I was shooting at the brothels. So fixing up those things, it took me like 4 months to get into the brothel and speak to these people. So the entire documentary was on human trafficking. So getting into that, getting into the brothel and speaking to these people, it took at least 4 months for me to talk to these people and make them understand what exactly we are doing and what they are shooting.
Okay. Ms. Craig, now I wanted to ask you regarding how do you find the right fixers? Because there are so many fixers, and then we don't have a database, we don't have a union. I mean, there's no, like, is it a very peer review system? Like, you know, I trust you, you trust someone, so I trust like, eventually that person. So how does it go about when you find a fixer?
For me, it's always been done by word of mouth, really. Often people will use local journalists. When I was first in Yemen, I was working for a local English language newspaper anyway, and that's how it kind of started. And then it's all by word of mouth after that, particularly when you're moving around the country and looking for other individuals. At the start of the war in Yemen, Ammar, the guy who I started working with in Aden, I'd never met him before, and the person that I normally work with in Aden was too afraid to work with me once the war started and just recommended him. He'd never worked with international media before. He was a doctor, which turned out to be very handy because we spent a lot of our time going through all the hospitals during the siege in Aden, and obviously he had very good access. He was also heading up some of the relief operations that were happening there when the UN agencies had left, and was responsible for handing out all the medical aid that was coming in by sea. So he turned out to be very good at his job. But at the beginning, it was really, and that's another responsibility we have, I had to sit down and explain to him kind of what the role was that I was expecting, if you like, and also when it came to interviewing people, the kind of ethics behind that and my own kind of journalistic code in the way you're asking questions, to avoid putting words into people's mouths, and the whole idea of, although objectivity is a bit of a myth in my mind, but doing that is in the best way possible to achieve that. Because I think if you don't sit down and explain that to people, you can't assume if they haven't had that experience before of working with journalists that they automatically know what's expected of them. But yes, it's normally done by word of mouth, and he's now worked with other journalists as well. But he even says now, I don't know what a fixer is. I don't know what that even means. Other than what he's learned is he's kind of gone along, if you like, and building up contacts so that he can then set up interviews for people and do all that kind of thing. So a lot of fixers do kind of fall into that kind of work because they're good English speakers in those kind of scenarios, and they might they're well connected in the place where they are, but they have no background in journalism at all, and so we then have a responsibility to make sure they know what our own kind of code of conduct is as well, so that everybody's kind of happy at the end of it, and equally to make sure that. I think a lot of them feel that they're treated very badly a lot of the time by the media, and that you that you have a working relationship with your local coordinators, the same as you would do with any other colleague that you're working with. I think a lot of them find themselves quite demeaned and not either well looked after or well treated a lot of the time, and that's often a complaint you hear from people that work with international media organizations who are extremely demanding, have very little understanding of the pressures some people are working under locally and the consequences for their family and all that kind of thing. So it has to be a kind of a very understanding relationship, and a lot of it is based obviously on communication, but yes, I think we have to be more understanding, again, as Bobby mentioned at the beginning, about the long-term consequences for them as well, once we've up sticks and left, what they're having to deal with afterwards, because that can often go on for a long, long time. And also make that clear to them from the beginning if they haven't had that kind of experience before, because they might not be aware of the reach that your reporting has, and that's often the case. And therefore the consequences for them from helping you. And you always have to I always give people an option. You don't have to do this. If you don't want to help me because these are the consequences, then we don't have to work together. It's not putting undue pressure on people as well is quite an issue.
From democracies to authoritarian regimes, we have fixers all over the world doing different kinds of job. But yesterday, something you said, Bobby, stuck out, that they live a lie, basically to keep their families safe, friends safe and all. So could you share some anecdotes about some of the fixers you worked with and the lengths they went to protect their families and themselves in the long run?
Yeah, I think all of us who've ever worked in difficult places have stories like this of local fixers taking enormous risks and displaying extraordinary bravery. I've got dozens of these stories. The one that I'll sort of bring up right now is the case of Ali Shaheen, who was our chief fixer translator in Baghdad. And Ali, before the war, had been he had a chicken farm, and he sold eggs for a living. And after the war, the farm was destroyed. He came to work for Time because he spoke very good English. And he learned, as you said, he learned how to be a fixer translator while he was on the job. But he knew instinctively that he was taking on a risk. In the early days after the war, it was not clear that he was doing a risky thing, but he just had an instinct that it was risky. So in his neighborhood, he just kept up the pretense that he was still going to his farm. So he'd come to the office at 6:30 in the morning, and I'd say, Ali, what are you doing here this early? And he said, if I have to keep up this pretense that I'm going to the farm, I have to leave the house at the time that I used to leave when I went to the farm. And he would leave the house at 5:30 in the morning because the farm was a couple of hours away. He would still keep up that pretense. Every now and again, he would go and buy eggs in the market and then take them to his home and distribute them among his neighbors, as if he was bringing eggs from his farm, because that was something he used to do when he had a farm. He lived that lie, if you like, except for a very few people of his closed family. Nobody knew that Ali was working for a foreign company, never mind Time magazine. 3.5 years he kept up this fiction. And then one day his wife went to buy vegetables from the local vegetable vendor down the street. And the vegetable vendor said, is it true that your husband works for an American company? And she said, no, why? Who told you that? And he said, well, there are a couple of people came up in a car yesterday. They were asking about you. They said your husband works for a foreign company. They said they wanted to know what time he leaves and goes to work. They wanted to know about your children, what time they go to school, which school they go to, how do they go to school. And obviously Ali's wife knew that the jig was up, and she was terrified. And she called Ali in the office. And Ali took the call in front of me. He spoke to her briefly, and then he told me I have to go. He didn't tell me what it was about. He drove straight to the children's school, picked them up, drove home, picked up his wife, drove them straight to the airport, put them on a plane to Jordan, locked the door of his house. This was in 2006, towards the end of 2006. It is now 2018. His family have never returned to Iraq. Ali went back and forth for many years. He never returned to his house for 2 more years after that. He would sleep on the couch in the office because he just couldn't take a risk that somebody might attack him. 2 years later, when he went back home, the house was this sort of amazing still life. I went with him. It was this life interrupted. There were still clothes in the washing machine. There were plates on the dining table. The beds were not made. They didn't even have time to pack enough clothes. And so those are the kinds of risks that people who worked with us in Iraq took. Ali no longer works for Time magazine. We shut down the bureau in 2008 or 2009. Hardest thing I ever had to do. But his life was forever changed and will forever be imperiled because he used to work with us at one time. There are groups in Iraq that will, if they know you used to work for the foreigners, do you harm. When we shut down the bureau, Time magazine, as I said, did the right thing, gave all the staff their very, very generous packages, but okay, is that the end of it? Do we no longer have any responsibility for Ali? Can we pretend that this is just like a normal employer-employee relationship where once the terms of the contract have ended, there is no further responsibility? I don't think so. I think I know as an individual that I owe Ali and will for the rest of my life. There are, like I said, dozens of stories like this, but that's just one.
Okay. So when I listen to your story about Ali, the scale of sacrifice done by a lot of fixers is very high, sometimes leaving the country, sometimes leaving the family behind and stuff like that. So, I mean, could you shared a very beautiful story with me yesterday about one of your colleagues had to move out of the country and stuff. Would you want to talk about it?
I feel like, I'm sure you have better stories than this one. I don't want to, I'll come back to it if you like, but maybe
I thankfully have never been in the situation where somebody has had to leave the country because of working with me. But I'm well aware that not working for a major media organization that I can't provide that kind of backup. And I was particularly aware of that in Aden at the beginning of the conflict when I was there during the siege, shortly after, that was in May 2015, that the guy that I was working with, I was even smuggling myself in and out of his house and in niqab, just because at that point it wasn't clear. It looked like the Houthis were going to take the entire city, and if that happened, it was going to become immediately clear or very easy for them to find out who was working with the foreign journalist. For that reason, I didn't do any of my reporting until I'd left the country. But even moving in his neighborhood, I was wearing niqab all the time, and he referred to me as the old woman to all his neighbors, as if I was like an old aunt that just come to visit for a few weeks. And actually, we've kept that up. So even now when I go back, for various security reasons for both himself and for me, actually, it's worked out as the best way to kind of operate. But I was acutely aware that if something happened, that because of the visa situation, particularly for Yemenis, trying to get him out of the country was going to be incredibly difficult. And actually, I say my way around it. It wasn't a way around it, but because after I'd been working for him for a while and he was extremely good at helping me, I then recommended him to Human Rights Watch, and he has since been working for them as a researcher. But again, he's been doing obviously very controversial work, research for them that is, there are belligerents within the war, in the territory where he lives, that makes that incredibly risky. So he doesn't get any recognition for any of that either, for his own security, but also even through working for Human Rights Watch, there is no system set up to evacuate him to get out of the country because of the logistics of the visa situation of trying to get Yemenis out. Even if he did manage to get a visa to get to Jordan, for example, that would run out every month. And so, yes, as a result of that, he doesn't get any recognition for anybody doing what he does, and yet he is taking a huge amount of risk in doing all of that. So there may be a situation, there very well be in the future where, like the story that Bobby's just told, that he will have to leave the country and that he would have to leave all of his family. He, although he's not married, doesn't have children, he's got 3 brothers, he is the only now money earner in his family, so he's providing for all of both his parents, really, and his brothers. And so if he did have to leave the country, that would also have repercussions on them as well and how they're living. So he lives on a knife edge, if you like, and has taken a huge amount of risk to do work that obviously that he believes in very strongly, but there are very few support mechanisms there. Even though he's working with a known international organization, their options are also very limited of how they can help him.
Okay. So now this question is for all three of you. This is related to training that fixers receive, because a lot of them are not journalists. They come like doctors, drivers, and stuff like that. So should news organizations have a training module where they could teach them the basics of journalism, ethics, biases, filtering biases? Yeah, maybe something like that.
Maybe I think it will be great if the fixers would get an opportunity to get a training on this entire subject.
Okay, training in like what?
Training in reporting, like photojournalism, stuff like that.
Okay.
I don't want to be a stuck record on this, but the thing that we're talking about, creating these principles or protocols, we can do this online. You can create a system of tutorials where anybody working as a fixer understands their rights and understands what it is that media organizations look for from a fixer. These can be done video, they can be done for photojournalists as well, but there can be video modules teaching in multiple languages, teaching local fixers what is needed from them, what they can expect from their from their employers, what risks that they are incurring. Sometimes they don't understand fully the risks, what risks they are incurring, what steps they should take to minimize the risk. Giving them useful advice. I think you can create these resources. An organization like IJF can create resources like that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's also, on the training side of it, it's then knowing, people on the ground knowing what's expected of them a lot of the time, because I think we're, as journalists, not always clear. We make assumptions that people understand what we're trying to achieve, and without that kind of, I think having that outlined, and whether it's through training or like a code of conduct, people will have a better understanding of what is expected of them, some kind of basic journalistic ethics as well, of how journalism works. I think, we tend to make a lot of assumptions that people know all of this, particularly people that haven't had experience of working with media before, and people don't. There isn't, this automatic sort of understanding of how the media kind of system works, if you like, or what is expected of people. And I think a lot of the time, because everything is done in a huge rush, a lot of the time on the ground, you go in, you might only be there for a few days for some media organizations, and you're pushing people all the time to get access to stories and things like that without having beforehand sat down with somebody and kind of clearly explained, A, what you're trying to achieve, but B, how you operate, and what your kind of ethics are, what your safety system is, all of those kind of things. Very, very much people will go charging and expect somebody on the ground to do all the work for them without actually having that kind of clear, calm conversation beforehand, and giving that person the opportunity to ask questions about what is expected of them. We're often just, those kind of line of communication very rarely exist, and that's where you often have the breakdown in the field then when people, have extremely bad experiences, and it gets very antagonistic just because the real basics haven't been discussed at an earlier stage, and there's a lot of misunderstanding can happen.
Okay. It's worthwhile, actually. It cuts both ways, as you were hinting there, that there need to be some rules of engagement, that reporters and photographers or video teams operating in these places need to know how they should be treating their fixers and coordinators, what they can reasonably expect and what they should not, what is unreasonable for them to ask. Most journalists who've been in the field for a couple of years learn this on the job, but we are getting into a situation where more and more you have freelancers arriving in a war zone with very little experience, and are hiring somebody on the fly and are expecting them to do things that, frankly, they shouldn't expect, and they shouldn't put pressure on them to do those things. And so it would be useful, I think, to have a set of rules for reporters and for journalists going into a difficult situation for them to follow as well.
Okay. So, Rajesh, I want to ask you a question. So, when international journalists or news organizations come to you, do they come with a pitch saying we want so and so specifics for the story? And do you always get to see the final product? And if you don't get to, then have you ever been in a situation where you face some sort of problem because the pitch given to you was different than the final product?
So always they come with a pitch. They have their own synopsis, they have their own story. And I need to find all those things. But when it is finished, definitely I am not getting to see what is the final cut. And most of the time it has not happened. Sometime, like, I do have received some final cut, but otherwise they won't.
So has it created any problem in India, specifically with the government and everything happening right now?
No, I don't think so. It's not like that.
Okay. And with fake news taking center stage for the last 3-4 years, elections and everything, how crucial are fixers to verifying information on ground, especially in conflict zones, because there's so much war happening, different sides. So how crucial are they?
Yeah, that can be, incredibly difficult. And I think there have been previously issues where that have come up where local fixers have been under such pressure to find a particular interviewee that it's ended up being a cousin or somebody else or a friend of a friend who has taken the place of a genuine interviewee as well. I think probably the most famous case of that was the pirates in Somalia, I think. So yes, I think the journalists, the fixers obviously play an incredibly important role. Even once you're out of the country, when you're trying to back up information for your reporting that you're doing, is contacting them to verify stuff on the ground. But also, it also potentially creates can create an issue where we as journalists have to be absolutely sure about as I said before, about the issues over ethics and things like that it's very clear with fixers who are under an immense amount of pressure to avoid those kind of situations where they're trying to produce an interviewee because they're under a huge amount of pressure for something that might be slightly unrealistic, that you end up with kind of creating kind of fake news situations. But yes, I think particularly when people are working remotely outside of the country a lot of the time, we will often be using those as local sources to confirm things that are being reported in either local or international media. So even once we're out of the country, that kind of thing, a lot of the time they don't even get paid for. You'll be calling them up or contacting them by WhatsApp 3 times a week. Oh, can you confirm this? Can you find out this? Or do you remember that person we interviewed 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago? I need to contact them or whatever. All that kind of thing often happens without any additional payments as well, that we rely on people very heavily for, and they're having to make additional phone calls, et cetera, and helping us out on an almost permanent basis without any remittances for that.
Okay.
Sorry to. How many people here have used fixers? Show of hands. Okay. I think it might be useful to get some other perspectives.
Yeah.
Anybody want to sort of contribute to this discussion? Sure. So just.
My name is Raj. I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists, and you're mentioning a lot about the codes, the need for guidelines, et cetera. And I wonder if you've heard of a culture of safety alliance and the freelance safety principles.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So if I can just mention them quickly, one of the freelance safety journalist principles came out of concern about how freelancers were being treated in the Syrian war, but more broadly in conflict zones. And the idea that you need to create a culture of safety where you can have a conversation about things like payment, like insurance, like safety equipment, and that should apply to freelancers, and fixers are usually freelancers. So I think, you have all of the major wires who have signed on to this, you have many major newspaper
she did.
It's okay. It's all right. We need to be repeating it. It's okay.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
Anybody else?
Actually, I think we can probably hear you. This is a sort of lovely room for acoustics. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Mariana Thomas. I work for Forum Journalismus and Media in Wien. It's an organization in Vienna dealing with training of journalists, and I organize courses for journalists on foreign affairs. I'm a former war reporter. I have never worked in languages that I don't know, and I have several questions. I've never used a fixer. I covered the Balkan Wars and conflicts in Central America for El País. And I have following questions. While working in the Balkans, and I'm originally from there, I have seen how fixers can manipulate journalists. And they set the agenda. I would like to ask you, how do you control that? I would like to ask Rajesh, to what extent people who come and ask you for your services know the situation on the ground? Or it is all improvised. You just said that you need 4 months for certain permits. They should know that in advance. If they don't know it in advance, it means they don't know the situation on the ground. So it means, you're probably very professional, but someone else can set the agenda. And I also do training of journalists and diplomats on how to use media for analyzing certain international political developments. And I tell all of my participants to watch out. We are never really sure in certain situations whether the journalists know the situation or it's all the work of a fixer. And you have all mentioned very important aspects, but there is the other aspect as well, and that is the aspect of users and those who use this information. Thank you.
So,
No, about international journalists coming to the country, not doing their groundwork, so they expect you to swiftly find case studies or get permissions. So how do you deal around with that?
How well prepared are they
Yeah.
usually when they come?
sometimes they are prepared. The thing is that if you want to take when I was working in a brothel, so if you want to take an interview inside a room or something like that, it is okay, we can do that thing. Otherwise, if you want to shoot in a brothel, in an open area, you need some sort of permission. And for that permission, and to convince the brothel people, okay, we want to shoot all this, all people are not ready at a time. Like, they won't allow us to shoot on that area because you need certain kind of permission. Then there are goons and people who don't allow us to, allow you to.
Not official permissions, but permissions from the local
Yeah,
gangster.
permission from the local people. If you're not taking permission, if you're doing it in a room, if you're taking some interview with the prostitute in a room, it is okay.
Yeah.
They will allow you. But apart from that, if you want to shoot the entire brothel, they are not ready for that. So you need to convince them, and it take a lot of time to convince them, to tell them what exactly we are doing.
Okay.
I think the issue of potential biases that come through when you're doing that kind of work, I think it is a real issue, particularly people who are dipping in and out of countries quite quickly. For me, it's something when I'm working with somebody who's new necessarily, it's being very upfront about that at the beginning, without kind of immediately distrusting people, but explaining that may be one of your concerns. I think for me, again, because I speak enough of the local language, you can tell, very quickly when things are necessarily being manipulated in translation. Whenever I've had doubts about that, as with all journalists now, you're recording all of your, even for print journalism, any of your interviews anyway. And if I've had any doubt, is to get that independently translated. And I think with most TV crews, again, maybe not so with breaking news, I guess, is a lot of the stuff a lot of the work is translated back home independently in addition to having it done at the time. But I do think, there are serious concerns about that. And even in kind of story selection as well, of that being manipulated locally on the ground. And of course, like you say, if you've got the background of having been somewhere for a long time, you know when something's up and something's fishy and that it's not right. And I think particularly when you have got people parachuting in, yes, that is a big problem. And I think it's something that that's not the kind of work that I do, but I've seen it again myself, like that, how people are manipulated in order to kind of create a biased outlook, particularly when you're working in a country where there's a civil war, if you like, and there's a division, and people have got agendas. But I think that it is a very difficult thing to get around, but I think we have to explain to people very immediately when you're working with them that these are your concerns, and that if there is any doubt, you need to get everything independently translated, I think, before you're doing any kind of publication or broadcast. I don't know what other ways there are to kind of avoid that kind of a problem, and it is an issue.
Again, the word of mouth helps.
Yeah.
If fixers develop reputations from working with a bunch of journalists. So if I were to go to Yemen, return to Yemen tomorrow, I would ask Iona. And Iona would have worked with a bunch of people, and she would be able to vouch for them, and vouch for not just their language capabilities, translation capabilities, or their knowledge of the local scene and their connections, but also vouch for their credibility and whether or not they've done the kinds of things you're describing. I think that helps too. Preparation and word of mouth is basically what you rely on. I was counting yesterday when we were sitting down and chatting and preparing for this. I've worked with stringers and fixers in 15 or 16 different countries, and I can only think of one instance in that entire time when it was clear that the fixer was not being entirely honest in the situation. On the other hand, I can think of hundreds of situations where fixers have risen above themselves, above their own concerns, their own biases, their own preferences to help me do the work that I needed to do.
Would you mind describing that instance?
Yeah, it was basically this incident, interestingly, happened in Yemen, and the fixer was from northern Yemen. We had gone to the south, and we had gone to meet a very important military person, a general, and the general was speaking in Arabic. My Arabic is good enough to know the gist of a conversation, but he was using a lot of technical terms, military terms, in Arabic, which I obviously didn't get. Fortunately for me in that instance, because of the rules, we had to hire, in addition to having my fixer from Sana'a, we had to hire a local fixer as well. And even though that person didn't really have any work, we just had to have the local guy. The local guy sort of later, the following day, told me, you know, your guy's not giving you the full picture here. The translation is, he's missing things in translation. And I thought that was an innocent, I said, is this an innocent mistake? You know, sometimes it'll happen with technical terms. He said, no, he's not giving you the full picture. Which set up a really interesting quandary for me, because do I confront my northern fixer and then therefore put the southern guy in difficulty, or what? Luckily I had those, as she said, I had everything recorded. I was able to check later on when I had left Yemen. For the purposes of, you know, we now file stories every day in addition to for online and so on. I just didn't use that interview for my dispatch that day because it was potentially tainted. I didn't want to take the chance. It was only later when I was able to come back, verify some things, that I was able to use quotes from that interview. That was the one example that I know.
Do you believe he was pursuing an agenda?
Yeah. And subsequently, again, word of mouth turns out that, yeah, he did have an agenda.
I have a question. So do you also discuss political ideologies with fixers you work with? Because it's good to know, like, what are their affiliations or whatsoever.
I think I usually do. It's just a human interaction. If you're particularly in a place where there is great crisis, they want to tell you where they stand quite often. And you want to know where they stand. What do you think?
Yeah, you do. But again, I think going back to what Bobby said, I actually found that the people that I've worked with, although they have their own inbuilt biases, particularly when you're working in a conflict situation within a country, they do rise above that. They understand that. And you, as long as you've had that conversation with them as well, you know what their own alliances or perspective is, but they understand that aspect of journalism of trying to reach the kind of objectivity kind of aspect that doesn't, that can never really be reached in perfection. But they understand the process of that and are very good actually at rising above that, their own kind of, inbuilt biases, if you like. But I think you do have to be clear with people about that. But generally speaking, I've never had a real issue in people trying to bend the kind of story to meet their own end, probably because, going back to this question, I've worked in the country for a long time, so I know from the outset, as and when, if somebody is trying to manipulate you in that way. But yeah, I think it's all about communication a lot of the time.
So at this point, I'd also like to show an interview we did with journalist Deborah Campbell. Miss Campbell in early 2000 went to Syria. She met an Iraqi fixer who had to flee Iraq because of US invasion of Iraq and stuff like that. So this woman, Ahlam, gave access to a lot of international organizations and journalists to report from her community on the problems they face. And what eventually happened was the Syrian security agencies got to her, incarcerated her for 10 months, and they asked her to spy on international journalists. So when Ahlam disappeared, Campbell went back to Syria, tried tracking her down. She was very worried about what happened with her. So we've done a short video, we've done a small interview, so I'd like all of you to see that.
The disappearance in Damascus is the story of my friendship with my fixer, a remarkable Iraqi woman named Ahlam. I first met her in 2007 when I was a freelancer reporting a story for Harper's Magazine on the Iraqi refugees who were flooding across the border. She was well-connected, a pillar of her community, and kind of like a one-woman NGO. Because she had these extensive contacts and because people trusted her, she was an excellent fixer. She worked for everybody. She worked for BBC, Al Jazeera, Reuters, NPR, also Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, UNHCR. We became good friends, and a year later I was back in Damascus after the story ran, and she was arrested in front of me by Syria's secret police. The book is about my search for her. One of the reasons I wrote the book was to bring attention to the life of a fixer. It's one of those jobs that nobody's heard of, and yet fixers are responsible for bringing us most of the news from the world's most dangerous places. Most foreign correspondents have used a fixer in some way, whether as a driver or translator or guide, or to help them make contacts. I'd previously avoided using fixers. In my work, it's more like immersive journalism than daily news. I tend to spend long periods of time in the societies I'm writing about, so I work through friends, whether, for example, an archaeologist, university students. Once in Iran, my fixer, unofficially, was a poet. Or I've worked through local journalists. One of the reasons that I've been a little bit reluctant to use fixers is because a lot of fixers are forced to register with their governments. They need permission from authorities to operate, and often in return for that, they may be under pressure to spy on you. Because of the way Ahlam worked, she was unofficial. She wasn't registered with Syria's Ministry of Information like most Syrian fixers were compelled to be, and I came to really trust her. But she was being spied on. And when she was arrested, the Syrian secret police tried to turn her into an informant to spy on us, on journalists. She refused, and for that reason they kept her locked up. When freelance journalists or fixers run into trouble, we're sort of in the same boat. There's no one we can call upon to help. And the difference between a fixer and a freelance journalist is generally that the journalist has a passport that can serve as some kind of protection. The worst thing that can happen to us in most cases is that we're deported. We have to go home. For fixers like Ahlam, that's not an option. If she was deported to somewhere like Iraq, her home country, that could be a death sentence for her. So she was stuck. What helped Ahlam in the long run was that she had so many connected friends, journalists like myself and others, and NGOs who lobbied for her release. And not everyone has that. But it's my belief that that advocacy is the reason that she was eventually released and flown to Chicago by the UNHCR. We've remained friends. I see her regularly. And right now we're both consultants on the film that's being developed by Terry George, who made Hotel Rwanda. So what can we do to protect fixers? Well, first of all, I think coming to acknowledge the key role that fixers play in bringing us world news. Fixers do invisible work, so we don't tend to see them. They're behind the scenes, and many want it that way. It's a risky job, and they may not want their names known. But if news agencies, if media outlets accepted a sense of responsibility and created a policy to advocate for fixers who are endangered because of their work, that would be a good start. Secondly, reporters can acknowledge that they have a responsibility not to put their fixers at unnecessary risk. That's not easy to do, but it starts with awareness. So finally, the main thing I think we can do right now is to start talking about it, to start acknowledging the importance of fixers and our moral responsibility, whether as reporters or as media outlets, to take steps to protect fixers when they get into harm's way, so that they don't end up in the situation Ahlam did, or worse.
Based in Egypt until very recently. The question I wanted to ask was, when I first started working as a Middle East reporter, I wasn't really given that much training. Hostile environment training came actually after I'd been engaged in several conflict zones. In that hostile environment training, I realized that there was never any discussions about how we should look after fixers. And is there any way of that being introduced? Because, I mean, these companies put us through hostile environment training basically because of insurance, but shouldn't that be part of it? Because I mean, just from a selfish perspective of these organizations, they have to deal with the death of a fixer. The other point is it's slightly different from fixers, but there's a sort of pattern in international journalism where you have usually a white correspondent who doesn't speak the language of the country that they are being posted to, going there and working with a local news assistant who does all the reporting on the ground and maybe gets a second byline or anything. I mean, is there any way of being able to have a kind of paradigm shift in the way that we treat not just fixers, but our news assistants? Because I don't think the readership, I mean, the readers are not realizing that the majority of this work is coming off the back of not the white correspondent whose name is first on the byline.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what Bobby was saying right at the beginning, and we kind of discussed at length yesterday evening, is that there needs to be a way that the media organizations do acknowledge fixers, whether it's a kind of additional reporting line in it for print journalism. I think in broadcast media, there is a tendency to do that more anyway, because you get credit, particularly for documentary filmmaking and things like that, where at least people will be acknowledged and given a credit. I think in the print media, we're particularly bad about doing that. The Wire's a bit better. They will at least acknowledge and give names to people at the bottom reporting anybody that's contributed to that. But yes, I do, as Bobby said, we need to have an overall kind of code of conduct, really, how we all operate in giving fixers both recognition and a system of safety. And going back to the safety issue, as I said earlier, in 8 years, I've had one media organization when I've been working as a freelancer who's asked about providing insurance coverage for a fixer. What I've done personally is I take an extra medical kit that the fixer can use, and I train them how to use it. That's really important. You know, we've all done the hostile environment training. It's not much good if you're the one that gets injured and they can't help you because they don't have the equipment or whatever else, and vice versa. So yes, I've always taken you know, one of my smaller pouches and I normally leave that with them, so they have it all the time. And train them, you know, the basics of how to use the tourniquet and on all those kind of things, because that doesn't happen otherwise. It should happen. I think particularly when media outlets are using somebody, you know, very regularly, that they need to have some kind of basic training in first aid and that kind of thing. But, you know, as we were saying earlier, the wheels are moving slowly in the sense of that movement has happened really now for freelancers and is getting considerably better, but we do need to kickstart something to make sure fixers get the same as freelancers do now, and that we do have a kind of code of conduct and a way of looking after people better than we're doing right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've been saying at the beginning, let's make the rules, let's create just a show of hands. Principles or protocols, which sounds better, principles or protocols? Principles. So principles. Let's do this, folks. Let's set up the Perugia principles, and let's first put our heads together, come up with a set of these rules and resources that we can make available digitally and otherwise, and then sort of put pressure on news organizations to sign up. It's been done for freelancers. The Committee to Protect Journalists has done great work there. Why not for fixers? I don't see why not.
Any last questions?
Hi, my name's Lawrence. I'm a freelance journalist, and I've done a lot of what I would probably characterize as community journalism or participatory journalism in places like Sierra Leone and Nigeria. And I just wanted to get your reflections a bit more, perhaps, on, you know, in line with these principles, how we could perhaps formalize the idea of skills transfer, because one thing that I think, and it's really good that we're talking about this openly, about sort of troublesome definition of a fixer. You know, one of the things that I found to be incredibly rewarding is investing in the skills that I can offer, just as much as a local fixer is investing in what they can provide for me in a story that we're working on in unison. And I just, felt like that sort of skills transfer is something that is quite an important thing to reflect on. I don't know whether or not any of you have any sort of insight into that, specific examples, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tendency, at least I shouldn't generalize, I've had the tendency to assume that if someone's working for me as a fixer, that they want to acquire the skills of a journalist, that they want to become a journalist eventually. And that's sometimes the case, in fact, I would say often the case, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they don't want to become a journalist. They're fine doing, they set the definitions of what they want to do and what skills they want from you. I've done things like, I have said, look, you know, obviously I can help them improve their English, I can help them improve their writing skills. There have been a couple of occasions where I have offered to, and for a little time, provided English lessons to their children. So I think, and some of that is just human interaction, right? You're working with somebody closely in an incredibly difficult place, in a difficult situation. That's not a normal working relation. That goes deeper. You'll know this from your own experience. You've been in the trenches together, not to be melodramatic, but you've been in the trenches together. You're more than just colleagues, and therefore you're invested in each other in a more meaningful way, I find. And so it's just a human thing. I want to help, and how can I help beyond just pay you your fee? But I have to sometimes check myself and remind myself that they should decide what help they want from me rather than my imposing.
Yeah, I think certainly when I've worked with local journalists as well, again, it's kind of, a human interaction really, but it's helping them out as well to get work published internationally. I've done that quite a lot with English-speaking journalists in Yemen. Again, I've done, 2 or 3 workshops now in Yemen as well to help out local journalists. Sometimes that's been on safety, on investigative journalism, and equally that's a two-way thing as well, because they obviously have far more experience in working locally about, you know, the limits that they can push to, and their experiences on the ground. Their knowledge is far greater than yours is, so it works both ways. But yes, I think we're not very good at that as well, actually, is building on that kind of transfer of skills, as you mentioned, which could be beneficial to both sides, really.
I'd be curious to hear from Rajesh. When you work with these foreign crews, are there any skills that you want from them, that you want them to teach you, to help you get?
I want to get into photojournalism. I want to know the ethics, the rules, how it works.
Do you find them cooperative? Do they help you?
Yeah. Most of the time, but still, I do want to learn more doing photojournalism.
Thank you, Ayana, Bobby, and Rajesh for the insightful session, and thank you all for being here. I think it's time to wrap. The next session starts in a few minutes.